All right, everybody. I think in the interest of time, we'll get started with some introductions and people can trickle in as we begin. Um, Hello and welcome to PGTME's sixth annual Lunchtime Lecture Series. My name is Aidan Ilmus, and I'm the program coordinator for the Working Group on Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics, or PGTME as we like to call it. PGTME is a project of the Division of Medical Ethics housed in NYU Grossman School of Medicine's Department of Population Health and is funded in part by a gift from Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. You can learn more about PGTME at the link to our webpage, which is going to be shared via the chat function. The Lunchtime Lecture Series, or the LLS, is our hallmark educational event and will continue throughout the rest of this week. So please join us daily from 12 to 1:15 p.m. Eastern for free virtual sessions on more pressing topics in the gene therapy space, featuring expert speakers and audience Q&A. And a link to the registration page for the last 2 days of the LLS will be shared in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us for today's panel, Communication, Data Sharing, and Reporting. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on PGTME's YouTube page next week, along with recordings from the rest of this year's Lunchtime Lecture Series in case you missed any of them. So today's event will feature some brief introductions from our speakers, followed by a moderated discussion. And we've also saved time for at least 15 minutes of audience Q&A at the end. So we encourage you to submit questions throughout the panel today using that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen throughout the panel. And with that, I am going to introduce our moderator and hand the microphone over to him. Dr. Tim Cripe is the Chief of Pediatric Hematology and Oncology and Blood and Marrow Transplantation at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, and a professor of pediatrics at The Ohio State University. His research focuses on leveraging viruses to develop novel therapeutic approaches to pediatric cancers. And he has published more than 170 manuscripts, served on numerous national and international committees, and is a former chair of the US FDA's Advisory Committee for Cellular Tissue and Gene Therapies. And of course, he is also a member of PGTME. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tim to take the discussion away. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for being here.
Thanks, Aidan, for the nice introduction. And yes, my greatest accomplishment is being on the PGTME. It's been a lot of fun and insightful. And today I'm looking forward to our interesting conversation. We're here to talk about data sharing, communication, and reporting, which is really something that, if you think about it, is obviously very important. Everybody says, the problem's communication in all aspects of our lives, but in gene therapy in particular. And I'm also a co-founder of a now clinical stage company using gene therapy for cancer, and I'm also sensitive to this issue. What we need to share data when we've had deaths or side effects, particularly serious adverse events. What's going on, and what can we as a community learn from that, but more importantly, what do parents or potential participants of these therapies need to know, and how do they gauge the risks and benefits and so forth. So very important topic. We have three fantastic panelists to discuss it, and let me just welcome them one at a time. Dr. Cara Weismann is Director of the Program of Excellence in MPS and Lysosomal Storage Diseases at the Advanced Therapies at the Orphan Disease Center at University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Cara. Thanks for joining. We also have Rachel McMinn, who's the founder and Chief Executive Officer of Neurogene. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Erin Ward, who's co-founder and president of the MTM-CNM Family Connection, a nonprofit for myotubular and central nuclear myopathy. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So each of you have your own perspectives and your own experiences and probably frustrations with communication. I want to break our conversation in general up to sort of what's the current state, why is it inadequate, why is it the way it is, what frustrations have you had, and so forth, and then follow that in the second half with sort of what's the ideal future state, what can we do now, how do we get to where we want to be, and all that. So, and I just want to start by going around the three of you to tell us your perspective, tell us your background a little bit, tell us why this is an important topic to you. So maybe we'll just go in order that I introduce you. So, Dr. Weismann, why don't you give us a start?
Hi, good morning or good afternoon. Thank you. So I come to this topic in general because within the Program of Excellence, I run a grant program where our goal is to fund research into rare disease and to accelerate the development of those therapies in a way where we target everything from initial diagnosis all the way to access. And in that situation, we look at areas such as data sharing as a major challenge. I specifically have worked in these areas previously. At the NIH, I worked on genomic data sharing policy during a AAAS fellowship. So I've experienced in that policy and controlled access areas, as well as looking at the data sharing policy in general. And then I've also worked with CureGM1, who has a data sharing collaborative where we had come together a couple of years ago to make resources available to the community to accelerate drug development by creating access to natural history studies and registries that are already in place, and to help to accelerate that information to be shared. Then over the last, in the spring and summer, I was so grateful to hold a workshop with CPATH that I'm sure will come up a good amount today. In that workshop, we actually looked to see how we could help to understand, incentivize, and help assist people who have natural history studies and registries, and help them to share that data, whether it be things that have already begun, and so do it a retrospective analysis to set that up for a prospective way in a study that has not been started, and to help create collaboratives so that data can be shared more widely. So I think that these experiences and our work with data sharing policy in general will help to inform our next steps here. And I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Dr. McMinn, why don't you give us sort of a background bio and why this is important?
Yeah, so I'm just going to come at it from a slightly different perspective. So let me just first introduce Neurogene. So we're a gene therapy company focused on developing treatments for rare neurological disorders. And the mission of our company is deeply personal to me. My older brother lives with a rare debilitating neurological condition. And I've obviously personally witnessed the toll it's taken on him and our family, first as his sister and now as his guardian. I still don't have a genetic diagnosis for him. There's no treatment for his disease. But I realized that I could take the experiences that I've lived and actually use them to potentially make a difference for other families facing similar struggles. So that's why I founded Neurogene in 2018. And why we're kind of gene therapy is because this is really the time when gene therapy was just, starting to show the potential to transform lives. When founding the company, I obviously needed to focus in on, what indication. I happen to be drawn very much to a disease called Rett syndrome. It's a rare neurodevelopmental disorder. It's not what my brother has. It primarily affects girls, but I did find, kind of this, I don't know, attraction to it because some of the symptoms are actually overlapping with what my brother has. And for brief background, Rett syndrome is caused by a variant in the MECP2 gene, and there's multiple clinical domains that are impacted here. So these girls are typically nonverbal, but then their inability to communicate effectively is really compounded by the fact that they can't use their hands in a purposeful way. They have gross motor deficits. Half of them can't walk, and they have a whole host of, a lot of other very serious comorbidities. So our lead program, NGN-401, is an AAV9 gene therapy for Rett syndrome. And we recently shared positive efficacy data for 8 pediatric patients. And all of them are showing functional improvements across the core domains of Rett syndrome. We're seeing continued gains of skills even 2 years post follow-up, suggesting that we're truly altering the course of disease. And we're now, we've already initiated dosing in our registrational trial. So here we are just, 7 years later. So it's really remarkable. But the reason why we're here is to really talk about something else that happened, which is, we did have a serious adverse event that led to a death of a participant who received a 3-fold higher dose than what we're studying currently. and has since been discontinued. And I wanted to really set the stage to give, everyone an understanding of what happened so that we can talk about exactly what you want to get to, Tim. So to set that stage, in terms of development, of course, we did a ton of, preclinical work, mouse studies, non-human primate studies. There was really no evidence of any concern, within, like very high doses of NGN-401, even in like this very conservative model of a, non-human primate study. And we selected our first dose in patients, because we know that these patients have one shot at efficacy, and we picked our lowest dose because we thought it would be effective. So we started enrolling these patients. As many of the listeners will know, there's a staggered enrollment. So we had, 8 weeks in between each participant dose. And effectively, by the time the next patient gets dosed, it's really a whole quarter. So you're like waiting 3 months in between patients. And then after gathering all that safety data at the 1E15 dose, we then said, okay, again, these girls have one shot. We don't want to leave efficacy on the table. We have preclinical data suggesting if we can get to more neurons, we could potentially have better, even more effects, like better benefits if we move to a higher dose. So we, again, moved into a staggered dose escalation cohort, dose our first patient, fine, dose our second patient, fine. And then very, very sadly, the third patient that got dosed, like had this unexpected, totally unexpected, rare hyperinflammatory syndrome that we've learned. It's called hemophagocytic lymphohistio, I can't even pronounce it, histiocytosis, or HLH. And ultimately, by the time we detected it, it was kind of too late, and she passed away despite receiving maximal clinical care. So as a company, we obviously we're devastated. We stopped this dose. We searched for every bit of information we could learn. We, dug up like a couple of mentions and like one case report here or there. We talked to experts, and, some of the things we'll talk about. What was so frustrating is that, there were case reports, but like nobody like talked about this at medical meetings. This was not something that was ever like put on the radar screen as a potential side effect of AAV, even though it was rare. And so we were digging in. We also looked at the FDA's safety database, so something called FAERS, and dug into the Zolgensma database, since there's like 4,000 patients who've been dosed, commercially. And we actually found 15 case reports listed in that database that are consistent with HLH that have never been discussed before. And so you might imagine that was, in a way, comforting to know that there were other case reports, but very upsetting to learn of like, how did we not know about this? This is insane. And, stepping aside from the emotional component and like, why didn't we know about it? What we did learn is that all of the case reports are associated with higher doses in this kind of like 1E14 vector genome per kilogram range. And when you take our fixed dose of 3E15 and you kind of divide it by kilograms, and you kind of get that, you're actually in that range. And so, we discontinued that dose. We're only using a dose right now in the E13 VG per kg range, and we've like made sure that no patient in our studies can ever get an E14 dose or higher. But in addition to that, we have monitoring. So we could have just moved forward and said, well, it's only associated with high dose, and like, that's fine. But as a company, we decided that's not acceptable. We put in a monitoring protocol. It's very simple, and we could spend time on it if people want to know, but it's a very straightforward monitoring protocol. And we have a treatment algorithm because we know that HLH is actually reversible if you can get to it soon enough. So, these are the kinds of things that we did. And then once we understood all this, not only did we change our own protocol, we then went out to multiple companies, like as many companies as I personally could, and connected all of our clinical teams together, shared this information. We shared it at ASGCT. We shared it at, RET specific meetings, and we've kind of gone out of our way to like really ring the alarm bell. And I will tell you, just without getting into the details, there's one case that I'm personally familiar with that I'm pretty convinced because I begged them to monitor for this very simple blood test with ferritin that's helps to diagnose this. And they found a very elevated ferritin. I'm convinced that as a result of that early detection, that patient actually survived this treatment. So sharing information has a direct impact on people, on people's lives. So look, we're just one company, I'm just one person, but I really feel incredibly strongly that we need to share these findings with each other to really prevent tragic outcomes. AAV is such a powerful, incredible tool, but we also need to find ways to minimize risks. So I'm working on, gathering a group of other gene therapy stakeholders to tackle this, and I really hope this conversation here today also helps to spur real change.
Yeah, that's a real compelling story, and the fact that you had to go dig for it. Fortunately, there was information that you could dig up. I'm sure there's a lot of information that isn't posted in those kinds of databases as well. Let's hear from Erin for her perspective, and the field of MTM has also had similar kinds of things happen to them, so I'm sure you have a lot of perspective on that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. And again, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this particular panel, and also for always including the patient and family voice on these calls. And Rachel, yes, a lot of things that you spoke about resonate very deeply with me and our community. And I want to thank you for robustly going after some answers and solutions, and also broadly sharing them as you can. And hopefully that will only continue the momentum forward. What brought me to the space of X-linked MTM is my son Will was born 24 years ago with X-linked MTM right here in Boston. And being born at a major medical center, we had the opportunity to really be involved in research. And in the course of his lifetime, we somewhat knew it was very early in the process, but also contributed every step of the way. In those parts of clinical trial development, we hear less about, from the importance of those natural history studies, the importance of observational studies, and laying the groundwork. Also through this journey, my husband and I, along with our partner Marie Wood and other families along the way, we organized and brought together both patient community, but also professionals, and then eventually pharma, in our landmark conferences, and formed the MTM-CNM Family Connection. So again, we really have walked alongside this community for the last 20 years, preparing for clinical trial readiness. We were very fortunate to have our first 3 clinical trials in a very short time frame in the last several years. One was AAV, one was antisense strategy, and one was repurposing with tamoxifen. Unfortunately, all 3 were halted because of issues with liver findings. And then, of course, probably most prominently known, unfortunately, 4 members of our community passed away from AAV. Now, it's also, our hearts go out to those families, and our work really continues in their honor. Interestingly, my son, Will, lived a very rich life with full capacity in terms of utilizing all of the tools that are available outside of a clinical treatment. That means for Will, he lived with a ventilator and tracheostomy, supported wheelchair, assistive technology, but he also had an incredibly rich life. He attended high school, graduated with his peers, and was actually an advocate himself. And I shared that because I think I really appreciated the comments that I heard yesterday from Colin, one of the members of the Duchenne community, and the importance of really looking at treatment development, not only for generations to come, but also those living with the disease. Interestingly, at the same, almost in parallel to some of the liver findings that came out in the clinical trials, my son was also having some liver findings that were really not well documented within our community. And so we were really working very closely with medical experts, and also doing our own research to probably try to characterize this better. And I have to say that some of the frustrations that occurred for us was when the deaths occurred, communication really halted. And I'm here to really encourage companies to really be thinking about how important it is to continue the conversation with the patient community when these events happen, not only to share the information, but to develop ways that you can learn and continue to have patients and their families that are really medical experts in these rare diseases be at the table to find the solutions together. And so having some frustration not being able to find a seat at the table, per se, together with the UK organization, Myotubular Trust, and Ann Lennox, who leads that. Together, our organizations formed a liver collaborative, and thankfully, our committed research experts, our scientists, as well as pharma industry involved, we all started to come together and look at trying to sort out what types of things were happening because of the AAV vector, and actually, what actually is maybe a pathology that has been underappreciated in this condition. So I'm here to help maybe shed some light on a strategy of a collaborative that has worked to move things forward in a very cohesive way, with everyone kind of understanding what each player is working on. We worked on partnering with our existing patient registry, so family members could start to contribute data outside the clinical trials, and then also encouraging the leaders of those 3 trials to really be communicating together to better analyze the data of the individuals who had these adverse events. I think we have a long way to go as a larger, broader community. How can we do this more efficiently? A huge thing that I really would love to be looking more closely at is, what secondary genes might be at play. Can we be encouraging full genome sequencing to better understand when these significant findings happen? What are the parallels between those that they occur in? Could it be that it's really not necessarily a disease-specific issue, but again, these secondary genes that individuals may not have compensatory measures when things happen. So I'm delighted to be here and looking forward to learning together.
You bring up a number of questions, and I think it speaks to the fact that we're really still at the beginning of gene therapy, and there's a lot we don't know. And as you broaden the applications, as you broaden the patient population, as you broaden the vectors and the different doses and dose routes, and you sort of expand the bell curve, you start to get things at the edges. And so, the rare or more rare things happen. So, and then you start to discover. So finding those out as soon as possible and figuring them out is going to be paramount. There are a lot of barriers to doing so right now, right? We have a question in the chat about SEC requirements for publicly traded companies, but there's also FDA requirements, and particularly for private and startup companies who there's a lot of sensitivity about these sort of things. So I guess I want to go back to Rachel to say, from a company standpoint, what are some of the current barriers, calculus about intellectual property, about investor sentiment, et cetera, that maybe counteract this sort of open access to data attitude?
I mean, personally, I think this is more of a corporate culture decision. And look, not there's different types of adverse events, right? There's things that happen where you're just trying to explore and learn, and you may want to have confidential conversations because it's you have ongoing studies, things like that. But when you have something life-threatening and a death, I mean, first of all, from a materiality perspective, every company is going to be required to disclose that, large or small. So I don't see that as a barrier. But the question is, then what do you do about it? And so I think as a field, what I'm concerned with is, look, we had, this very tragic event that I've already described, but there are other companies that have also had not the same, but, Erin, you talked about MTM, right? It was so heartbreaking because I was there watching these incredible videos of these kids getting so much better. And then to see that all sort of snuffed out because there wasn't a therapeutic window where you could safely really give the drug is just so heartbreaking for the MTM community. And so I think there was that set of deaths. Rocket reported deaths that seemed different. Sarepta had deaths that seemed different. Like they all seem to have these differences, and there's like one here or two here, even branching out to gene editing, right? And Intellia like had a very surprised. They had dosed hundreds and hundreds of patients, and then unexpectedly had a very serious liver event, and then that led to a subsequent patient death. So I feel like if we don't all come together in some sort of pre-competitive way and talk about and share, like what are the things that we can all do that's really in the best interest of advancing the field forward, like uh, we're never going to figure it out because we all have these like n of one, n of two type of experiences. But I don't actually see there being a barrier. And I think, to be honest with you, based on conversations I've been having with other CEOs, we've connected our clinical teams. No one said, "Oh no, we don't want to hear about that," or "No, we're not willing to share that information with you." So I'm sure there's always going to be like that outlier company that will disagree with me and like never share anything. And we should shame that company to make sure that is not possible. But I do think there's a real appetite, and I would say just because this, we've as AAV has been broadened out to indications, other indications that sadly we're running into these adverse events that are fatal or life threatening, and I think there's much more of an appetite to pull together as a community.
Yeah, I think that's a really important perspective, and glad to hear there's not really any good excuses not to share. But you had to dig for your information, right? And so, are there ways that, like, there's some barriers, not maybe not to sharing then, but to how we share or how you get their information? Well, how is it that most people get your information now, and is it reliable sources, and do you have to go dig for it? Anyone comments about that?
I mean, I'll just kick it off and then hand things over. I mean, again, like there was a case report, and we had to go chasing people down to talk to them about HLH, and then we started thinking like, gosh, there must be something in FAERS. And when we approached the large pharmaceutical company that's responsible, they refused to engage with us. Like they didn't help us at all. So and that's really unfortunate, and because it is like the largest global exposure of AAV. But I do think, the barrier right now is like literally like lack of organization, right? We've got multiple different groups, right? And I've been trying to help because I'm a little bit of that annoying person of like trying to whisper loudly or yell loudly in people's ears of like we have to have AAV safety meetings. So I think they are happening, but I want to like maybe help force this a little bit more. But it's almost like anything else, like to how do you get this movement like really well organized? And I can't do it. I'm CEO of Neurogene. I've got a full-time job, but I want to help advocate for this. And so to me, the barrier is like what organization, what group of people, what repository, like literally, like operationally. You can have all the ideas in the world, but if you don't have a plan behind it, it's never going to happen. So who's going to take the responsibility? Are we going to mandate things like, you know, genome sequencing of every patient that ever gets AAV, such that if there is an adverse event that is serious or life-threatening or fatal, like that all of that genomic information is available, and somebody then is routinely looking at that data because they've taken on that responsibility. There, right now, that does not exist, and that's why I'm sort of, again, screaming, hopefully, in a directed, constructive way for people to hear this, so we can do something about it.
Cara, that sounds kind of like in your bailiwick.
Yes, I think that one of the ways that we can look at ways to potentially bring people together is look at the policies that have already been in place from NIH and FDA funding. If we look at the ways that NIH funding occurs, and that does actually apply to clinical trials, some specifically through the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, or RDCRN from NCATS, they do have clinical trials, and they do have a clinical coordinating center. This one is actually run at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital and has been there for a while, a data management coordinating center. And that might be a good place to kind of start to see how these kind of groups could come together and have these discussions. And if you look at the policy associated with specifically NIH funding, all people who are going to apply for funding and have these grants, like I said, specifically in clinical trials as well, they are required to do reporting. Now, how that reporting actually occurs is different from institute to institute, and exactly if you have human experience as well as animal experiments, of course. But all this information could really lead us to putting together this kind of infrastructure. So you already have requirements in that case to have these kind of coordinated areas. And the FDA also has groups that they fund. The Orphan Products Grant Program also fund clinical trials and natural history studies, which could also provide information to come together. They also have reporting requirements. They are not the same as the NIH, but they do have reporting requirements in a general sense. So this is, I think, kind of the early areas that we can utilize these policies to get people to work together and to kind of set down ground rules and perhaps start there as a discussion point. Now, as Rachel was just saying, there isn't, now when sponsors come through that are not through grant programs, that kind of requirement is no longer in play. So perhaps we do use these policies as a jumping off point to work through those. The Orphan Products Grant Program is actually, they do their reporting through the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator and Data Analytical Platform that's run through CPATH and the FDA Joint Partnership. It's the RDCADAP is what it's called. And in both of those, all that information will be put in the chat here for people to look up and to reference. So I think that these are great places for us to start. But then the questions continue on. How do we then incentivize or help to encourage groups that are not funded in these areas? And I know that that's something that we're going to get to in the future, but I think actually kind of putting some policies in place and maybe also utilizing the policies we already have in place for grant funding might be a great place to start. But happy to get into that in more detail as well.
Erin, you have comments about that?
Yeah, it's related, maybe from a more patient-facing perspective. One of the barriers that I hear quite a bit is that when wanting to maybe look to do further data sharing is that these ideas were not presented in the original IRB consent to these families that potentially had either serious adverse events or have lost a loved one in these circumstances. And certainly can totally appreciate the challenges of a company or a team clinical care team thinking about having to go back to the family to ask for additional consent to use their data in a different way. But I really want to encourage challenging that because the amazing, brave families who I know who signed up to be in these trials sadly lost loved ones. I believe that many of them, not all, but maybe many of them, only hope that their loss will continue to help generate knowledge and learning for others. And the ability to have those courageous conversations, to consider going back, reconsenting, explaining, what next steps may need to be done to go back and do full sequencing if that was not part of the original protocol design in the IRB. I think also a big challenge is, a big advocate for evolving informed consent to being more than a one-time thing, breaking down the barriers to have this be an ongoing evolution that can be turned around quickly and pivot and add to. And, I'm someone who really believes that every person dosed in a trial should have the most updated data available to make that clear, informed consent. So I think that, these are some of the barriers I've heard in conversations when trying to challenge consideration of future data sharing of a patient within these trials. And just from the family perspective, just really want to encourage, not only after these events have occurred, but upfronting the conversations to really broadening the scope of informed consent to walk a family through, these are the considerations that we think may happen, and make sure that, death is being considered. And if that happens, these are the ways that maybe come back to you or ask for further consent to better understand. Um, these are all really sensitive topics, but just want to encourage these things to be considered when consenting families for these trials.
So it occurs to me that a lot of, because you might encounter something you hadn't previously encountered or even heard of, like HLH. We may learn things if such an event happens. We may be able to learn a lot from autopsy. A lot of times, if that's done at all, samples aren't necessarily provided to the sponsor because if they hadn't pre-arranged or material transfer or anything like that. Have you seen sort of that being discussed up front that possibility being discussed up front in a consent, and should that be something that is included routinely?
Yeah, I personally believe it should, and maybe it's a complementary consent if it can't be attached to the same one, but those are the times to be having those conversations. And I believe, and again, I believe that individuals who are willing to go through this process, families like ours are used to having difficult conversations. The diagnosis of these conditions are often the most difficult conversation a family will ever have. And so I really think that communication and clarity around the range of possibilities of what could potentially happen, pushing teams to also come up with I love that Rachel said that you have a clinical strategy plan in place if this outcome starts to surface again. I love what we heard yesterday from both Dr. Marks and Dr. Bateman, that, we should be having patient representatives reviewing all of these documents that inform consents, to ensure that clarity is there and putting the right people in place to have these conversations across your programs.
Well, and when we do have those kinds of events happen, we generally do update the informed consent to sort of include as current as possible, what the experience has been, so that patients can have that. But that can also take a while. Rachel, you have comments about that?
I mean, just to say that I agree that it's much better to do it up front, because you can imagine trying to do it after the fact if a family is grieving from having lost their child. Just that's not the time to ask for consent about samples. It's like the furthest thing from their mind, and every family is going to have their own reaction. And I think from a scientific perspective, it really is a loss if that information cannot be pooled, with other information, because these events they're not happening all the time, but they're sort of frequent enough where you want to be able to capture every single piece of data that you have. And it's almost cruel. It's like I view it as cruel, to go to the family after the event. Obviously, there's things that you can't always predict, Tim, right? Like, things happen, and of course you should evolve. And I agree with Erin, like, if there's things to evolve, and you should reconsent patients, that is absolutely the right thing to do. But I guess what I would say to all sponsors listening is I do think everything Erin just said is really important, to be able to, have that difficult conversation up front. And, hopefully you never need to act on it. But if you did, it's sort of there, and the science can move forward and make sure that that patient didn't die in vain, that there is something that gets learned for the entire community.
Is there any examples or a risk of, a lot of people get their information through media or your social media feed, or published media, or online something pops up, and is there a risk that the sensationalization of any of this has harmed progress or caused misunderstandings or set anything back, until the details are known? Have any of you encountered that sort of event or
I mean,
scenario?
I would say absolutely. I mean, there was I'll just call a spade because I'm pretty good at that. There was a patient death in the first ever brain penetrant capsid from a privately held company called Capsida. They're not subject to SEC rules because they're not a publicly traded company. And, you know, information that has leaked into the public sphere. I mean, unfortunately, the first patient that they dosed passed away within just a few days. So the alarmist reaction is like, oh my gosh, like all brain penetrant capsids must be toxic, and like, you can never touch anything ever again. And there's just this vacuum of information. And I would say this is nothing to even, never mind just sort of the broader, I'm just talking about even the scientists are in like this vacuum of information. And like, how do you know whatever you're working on or whatever company X is working on that you thought was pretty promising? Like all of a sudden, there's this knee-jerk reaction of like, well, we can't test it in patients who don't have a fatal disease. Like that's literally where people's minds are going because they're terrified of like, what if like any brain penetrant capsid just sort of has this very toxic profile and we don't know the receptor. Like there's a lot of information that has just been left out. So I think, people fill a void with negative sentiment when they don't have information that is just human nature. It's just how we're all wired as a group of beings. And being able to share accurate information is absolutely essential. And the more time that goes by in an out information vacuum, the more despondent people can be. So that is a real world example that is playing out now, that happened just a few months ago, I think in September, mid-September. So I just would point that out.
I guess that's a motivation for companies to make sure they get all the details out there so that misinformation isn't promoted. Um, if they understand what happened or if they can explain it away or
I mean, it's difficult being on the corporate side. I'll say, like, when our case was evolving, we reported it was just such a bizarre situation, but we were about to share our efficacy data for the first time ever. And that same day, the patient was admitted to the hospital, and we didn't know what was wrong with her. We just knew that something was not right. We didn't know, is it TMA? Is it something else? Maybe on balance, it's like inflammation. We had no idea. And it was just bizarre. And so, as a company, you just sort of are sometimes in an information vacuum yourself, right? Because you actually don't know what's going on. So I do think, there is some level of grace that should be afforded when a company has an event, like give them some space to figure out what goes on. But after a period of time, if there's not enough information, that's where, like, at some point, data does need to be presented publicly, and there should be a sense of urgency to get that out. So I think it's striking that balance of, you don't even know on day one, but at least, in a coming like 6 month period, for example, 3 month. I don't want to put a specific timetable on it, but something in that order, that you're at least able to share with people or committed to sharing information so that people know it's coming and that you're working on it.
and should there be a defined pathway for that or because right now you even said yourself, well, we presented this at meetings and workshops and and so forth. Should there be a more defined pathway, or are these different website links that have been posted here of different databases? Are they uniform? Should there be more uniform? Let's kind of pivot to what the ideal state would be. Um, who has comments about that?
Uh, if you don't, oh, go ahead, Eric.
No,
Erin, if you'd like.
well, I was just going to say that I think companies, when launching studies like this, really need to have a communication strategy for when these adverse events happen. And yes, I totally agree, Rachel. You won't have the data or the specifics of understanding maybe for some time, if ever. But in terms of having a communication strategy to go directly to the patient community and be able to have a conversation with them is highly important. It's something that we've been encouraging with our pharmaceutical partners who are on board with developing that moving forward. Where that was lacking with the deaths that occurred, it was incredibly unfortunate because through social media, the small communities that we work within, people learned of these prior to the public announcement of them, or even the direct announcement to the patient community. And when these things happen and there's pause and there's resistance or even shut doors or breakdown in communication, it builds mistrust. So that's really hard to regain, and we've had to work really hard with the organization and the pharmaceutical company who's taken on our condition and very gratefully has stayed committed to it. And we've worked really hard in partnership to really repair some things that happened in the past and moving forward together in a much more proactive way. So I really encourage people to be really thinking about having those strategies up front.
What is the update in the MTM world? Did they just exclude patients that had pre-existing elevated transaminases now, or what's been the
So
response?
actually in this July, Astellas announced that they received IND approval for the next phase of gene therapy, which will incorporate a myoAAV vector and are adjusting inclusion and exclusion criteria to try to accommodate.
So trying to use improved technology to avoid what happened before. Yeah.
That's really great to hear, Erin. I know that Astellas, I chatted with them, and I know they seem very committed. So it's nice to see that there's continued research going on.
Go ahead,
And
Cara.
thank you. So I just want to point out that there are not just some of these resources that we're specifically talking about when it comes to clinical trials, but there are a lot more basic research that is done at the NIH and information on genotype-phenotype relationships, um, basic research on AAV and in respect to that, and potential outputs. And I think that maybe some of this could be maybe consolidated in such a way, and I believe that this was put forward as a question previously when we were talking about this, is should the FDA and NIH have a more active role in investigating these therapies or these challenges and how we move forward? And I think that, yes, they should. I think that meetings can be held that brings together all of this information because a lot of it is occurring just in different spaces. And the resources that I put forward previously are maybe not the best ones for this particular kind of data sharing and information to occur. It might be a great place to start. But if we had meetings, potentially meetings on specifically AAV safety or whatever area that we would like to pinpoint, that we could bring all of these resources to the same space and start to have these more in-depth discussion, but in perhaps a controlled environment for sharing the data later on, rather than having it, like you were saying, in this a little bit here, a little bit there, at a workshop, at a presentation, but really have not just a defined communication strategy, but a defined data sharing and interrogation of challenges strategy that every sponsor would come to and look at and bring together. And so we could actually move this forward in a more streamlined sort of way. So I do think that there is a place to take information that we have already put together and have a more in-depth discussion that actually gets to the point of these challenges in a streamlined way. Like I said, the infrastructure is already here for a lot of it. It's just getting the right people in the right place and not necessarily motivating sponsors. I think that sponsors are completely motivated to make this happen, to have these discussions and not to have these challenges. So being able to accelerate the discussion about it, the interrogation of the problem within the infrastructure that already exists.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a crucial question, and the FDA meeting, the last FDA meeting on AAV safety was September 2021. The first case report of HLH was in 2022. So you just sort of take a step back and think about that, and you're like, wow. And we dosed our first patient in our low dose in 2023. And in late 20, back half of 2024, we were dosing this higher dose. So when you think about just the time that went by, and like there really was no public discussion about it, and no one is sort of ultimately responsible. That's why I think we really do need to define who that is. And in a way, FDA is uniquely positioned because regardless of whether you're a big company, small company, private company, public company, all of those safety events would be reported to FDA, and they're gathering all of that data. So it would be nice, if they were in a position to sponsor sort of regular meetings and kind of pull people together. There's obvious topics like immunosuppression. I'll just sort of throw out, not to go sideways, but just to mention to folks that here we are, the first treatments for AAV have been available for years and years now, and yet there is no concordance on what is the appropriate immunosuppression to use with AAV. And for a while, it was like, oh, steroids, that's not enough, and you really need more and more and more. And yet, some of the deaths that we've seen happened to be, it doesn't mean that they were caused by it, but happened to be in patients that were receiving much more augmented immunosuppression regimens. So are we actually helping, or are we exposing, because we're suppressing patients' own immune system so much, in an effort to blunt other things? It's a little bit like whack-a-mole. If you're trying to blunt TMA and you're like, okay, let's throw rituximab, let's throw sirolimus, okay, bang, bang, bang. And then oh, well, now we have this other thing. And guess what? That other thing's really bad too. And how does the underlying disease state contribute to this as well? Maybe patients, have very high inflammatory rates at baseline. This is something I've heard from other diseases, not specifically Rett syndrome, but other diseases where people are looking at the inflammasome of patients and they're like, wow, it's really, really high. And so does that contribute to, it's like what predisposes somebody? So there's just so much information. And it's like, well, who knows it? There's, some of these, immunologists who are spending a lot of time working on it. So I think there's a core group of academics that would be really great to hear from them on a regular basis. There's companies with all these events, so it'd be good to pull the companies in there. And then there's the FDA that sort of oversees everything and kind of, may have an even greater perspective, that if they could pull everybody together to make this happen.
Yeah, it sounds like a call for a day long or more workshop on these issues and to identify what the unknowns are and maybe even generate some RFAs for some new research. Because a lot of those things I think probably aren't known. And animal models may not reflect and don't reflect the human experience and particularly the range of variation that you might get with genetic predisposition or the influence of microbiome or etc. So there are a lot of unknown questions. Part of that then brings to my mind, well, how are patients supposed to balance these unknown risks or consider them? And one of the things that Colin Worth asked is, how do clinical trial participants who are already enrolled, gene therapy is different than most drugs. You could, if something happens with a drug in another trial and it puts the current patient at risk, they could stop the drug. Right? Gene therapy, you can't stop the drug. It's done and one and done and going on. So how do current clinical trial participants get informed of these issues, and what good does it do to inform them, right? I guess to monitor and maybe increase other or add tests for monitoring or something. But do you have comments on that?
I absolutely do. I do want to follow up just to Rachel's. I love all your ideas of gathering the reins and really figuring out how to move forward this together. I do want to just bring it to the audience's attention that there was a meeting on toxicity in AAV held by the ENMC, which is the European Neuromuscular Center, and that did bring together stakeholders from the US as well. And I don't believe the written report is that from that, but that should be something to be kind of looking for, as well as this summer I had been invited to speak at on a panel at the Academy of Sciences, and some of these topics were also shared. Looking at and even maybe NIH and taking a lead as well. But in terms of Tim, your last point, I think that again, there needs to be a lot of education with participants that are considering these trials. I think we need to really be encouraging companies and also the clinical partners in this and making sure that it's available in all kinds of formats, visual, having people with high communication skills, having these conversations, having navigators that are walking families through this entire process. Again, not seeing the informed consent as a one-time thing, but really an evolution over time, re-consenting prior to dosing with that up-to-date most information you have. I think a big thing that we're challenged by in our community is considering a possible future trial. And I know other communities that have multiple trials and multiple companies working on similar products is having some clear pathway that outlines it all, to really understand what are your options at this given point in time and how are they different, and what do we know. And so we have been partnering with our pharmaceutical partner, Astellas, and looking at some educational materials for families that may be considering the next trial. Just really, also though, we don't even have some data from the past trial, but also it's going to be a different product. So trying to explain all of that it's, different, is hugely important. It's a huge task. We looked at people like SGDC who are trying to do some educational information as well, more broadly.
So we're down to the last 15 minutes, which is supposed to be Q&A, but and we are getting a few questions in, some of which we've, I think, already covered. One of the most recent one was about maybe having a white paper submitted to the FDA to address these issues and figure out what role they can play. And I think Rachel, you kind of talked about that and what they could do. Any other comments, sort of about what could come out of this discussion? Right? Are we all going to just talk about it and then go back to our day jobs, or is there something that material could come out of this?
I mean, as I kind of hinted at in my opening remarks, I am working with a couple of different groups and really trying to push, to actually have this conversation, because like I said, in my conversations with other CEOs of gene therapy companies, it's been very positive. I mean, I think everyone has said, like, if there's something there, like we'll definitely participate and join it. So I think it really does come down to like somebody taking the reins. And so that's why I'm talking with these other organizations to figure out who can that be. And maybe Cara, if you see NIH potentially playing a big role here, or, if there's, FDA, obviously there's a lot of, leadership changes going on right now. So it might not be the best time to push on that button at this exact moment in time, but hopefully, as the new administration settles in a little bit more, that's something that we can aspire to have, FDA take more of a leadership position. But in the meantime, I do think, there are other bodies that, really do care about this modality. ASGCT is one, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine is another. You mentioned a European organization, and ultimately it always comes down to the individuals of like, are they going to make time and space for this topic and, come up with solutions? So I'm optimistic that, there are going to be additional discussions on this, including some of the things I talked about, like, can we all get together and talk about immunosuppression? It should be a big theme of like, what do we know? What do we not know? And can we get some research going on things that we don't know? So I would say, I think it's, the wheels are turning, not as fast as I would personally like to see, but I think there's enough committed people in this space that see a problem, and want to see changes.
I absolutely agree. I do think that this is a time for a call to have this kind of discussion, and I'm really glad that PGTME did bring this forward so we could sit down and start the discussion as we are today. But yes, I mean, of course, I do not speak for the NIH or anybody in government, but I do think that there is a lot of information, both at basic science level as well as clinical and translational research that could add to this, as Rachel had mentioned. But whether it be inflammasome or genotype phenotype challenges or susceptibilities, I do think there are additional partners that could also join this. The National Academies is a great place to hold a lot of these meetings, as Erin had mentioned earlier. Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA is also really great about bringing challenging topics forward and holding workshops. So I definitely think a workshop may be the next step for this, trying to define what the best controlled access data sharing infrastructure works. Like I said, there already are some of them that might be easy to fit into. But just really having the conversation, I think, is the biggest first step. And I'm really glad that this biggest first step is happening. I know it's been happening for a while, but to have it in this more open to the community sort of way in this lunchtime lecture series, I think is really great, because I think it touches a lot of people in different areas, whether that be patients, community, going all the way to clinicians and government agencies. So I think this is a great first step. I do think a white paper should be an output as well. But I think having some kind of workshop, some kind of bringing together of all of the stakeholders and having this a very frank discussion about what's next is really a good way to go. And we would be very grateful to play any role we could. Thank you.
That's awesome. Anyone else have final kind of thoughts or takeaway messages? Erin?
No, just very much appreciate having the patient and caregiver voice here, and would encourage that in any of these gatherings moving forward, having a broad representation from the community. But I also, in terms of data sharing, one thing that I just also want to resonate with, and I think everyone here kind of spoke to it, is as these therapies are designed to move forward, I think not only are we going to continue to learn more about the products and the AAV model and others, I think we're also going to learn that these interventions may also continue to teach us about these diseases in a way that we didn't fully appreciate prior. And so I think another part of that conversation is the ethics of making sure that natural history understanding that evolves within a company's product or within the structures of clinical trials also has a way of, with urgency, getting back to the patient community, especially if it's natural history understanding that can affect the lives of patients outside of a trial as well. So just another part of the data sharing and reporting that I'd love to see expedited.
Another big issue we didn't really talk about that's mentioned in the Q&A, although there's not really a question about it, is seropositive patients and that impact of that on gene therapy safety and outcomes, as well as being able to redose or include them in trials. I'm sure the individual posted a link to Ladders to Cures from the Broad Institute, had an event on that. So I just wanted to bring that up as well. Any other final remarks before we wrap it up here?
Since Erin brought up natural history studies, and it is an area I've been working on a lot in the past couple of years, I would have to say the more that we open up our natural history studies for sharing with the communities, not only do we get a good idea of the susceptibilities of the community to potential therapies, but also just having the opportunity to really understand how all of these diseases play a part in our natural evolution and the way that we're working together. I think the more of this information we have, and there's amazing groups of people that are putting together these natural history studies, and I know the patients really want this information out there. So I'd like to call for as much sharing of natural history studies as possible, because this is information that we already have that we can tap into pretty easily. And we could learn a lot from this that could influence where we go next.
I mean, I would maybe just leave things on a little bit more of an upbeat note. I think that, gene therapy as a modality is incredibly promising and there's certainly a lot of patients, thousands of patients at this point who've really tremendously benefited. And keep in mind the diseases that we're talking about. It's already very clear that without treatment, these families have really no hope and no options. And so I think this, the concept of what happens if we don't treat anybody, like nobody wants to see that happen. And I do think that the concept of benefit risk and making sure to engage with the community and making sure that they appreciate and they're willing to accept the uncertainties associated with, the continued learning that we are going to generate, over the next number of years. I almost think about this as like a little bit of if anybody remembers the car phone from a very long time ago, we now have iPhones and we're so used to like this incredible technology. We're a little bit in the car phone stage of AAV. It's clunky, it works, some of the time, maybe not as well as you'd like it to. It's not as convenient. There's a lot of deficiencies, but it connects people in a way that couldn't before. And so I think we're going to continue to build and hopefully get to the iPhone stage of gene therapy, but it's going to take time. It's going to take research. It's going to take, unfortunately, some setbacks, and we do need to share information in order to move forward. But I would just try to leave us on that upward trajectory. I really do believe that we're moving in that direction, but it's going to be essential for us to all come together to do better communication than we have in order to move to that iPhone stage for gene therapy.
Yeah, I actually just want to thank you for that, Rachel, because we know in our community that families and patients have had incredible benefit. And that, like Dr. Peter Mark said yesterday, we're not getting to a place where there's no risk. It's really about the informed risk and trying to evolve that as much as possible. So families for themselves can personalize those decisions, and that's going to look different for everyone. So I kind of come back to that importance of those early conversations and helping families with shared decision making and sorting out their personal risk benefit scale that they balance their life with, and the importance of it.
I think it's hard to top that, both of you. I think we should wrap it up there and go out with a positive note that the field will continue to innovate and we'll figure out how to deal with all these issues and manage them. And I'm going to pass it back to you, Aiden. Thank you, Erin, Rachel, and Cara, for being here today.
Thank you all so
Thank
much.
you.
So just thank you again. I'll echo Tim's comments to all of our speakers for such a great and open discussion today. And I also want to thank all of our attendees for your engagement and thoughtful questions. And be sure to tune in for tomorrow's panel. There's a link to register for that that's been put in the chat. Tomorrow's panel is called Navigating the Tensions, Maintaining Pragmatism and Ethical Principles in Research and Development for Genomic Medicines. That session will be a moderated expert dialogue about which ethical principles should be followed and from whose perspective during the research and development of genomic medicines, kind of building on everything that we've been talking about across the week so far, including the sort of ethics explained introduction we had back on Monday. And like I said, a registration link has been shared in the chat for that. So on behalf of PGTME, thank you again to all who have attended, participated, and helped put this webinar together, and especially to our speakers today. And have a great rest of the day, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.